Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Doug Weaver. I'm the chair of the Religion Department at Baylor University. This is an important day for Baylor University to have the Reverend Dr. William Barber, Bishop Barber, with us today. I'm very pleased that all of you are here. I first want to give thanks to Truett Seminary for allowing us to use their facilities. I see Dean Steele coming in. Thank you so much. We're going to spend most of this time allowing Bishop Barber to speak. I just would like to make a couple of announcements and acknowledgments. The idea of how you get Bishop Barber to Baylor is you know the right people. And I know Pastor Ralph West. Dr. West, actually we are very proud that he's associated with the Department of Religion these days. And I was talking to him and I said, you know, I'd really like to get Bishop Barber. He says, I'll give you his phone number. He gave me the bishop's phone number. I took a shot. I texted him and he texted me back, and he's now here. And so I'm quite happy about that. Series that deals with faith and public policy. I think in 3 years we have already put this on the map as one of the most important days in the academic year at Baylor. The very first inaugural lecture we had, our guest speaker was Dr. Kenyatta Gilbert. He is now the Dean of the Divinity School at Howard University up in Washington, D.C. As you know, Dr. Gilbert is the son of Robert Gilbert, whose statue is outside the Tidwell building along with Barbara Walker. Barbara Walker and Robert Gilbert are the first two African American graduates of Baylor University back in 1968. And to my knowledge, President Livingstone, the lecture 2 years ago was the first time that a member of the Gilbert family had formally given an academic lecture at Baylor University. We are very pleased about that. It set the bar high for this lecture, and now in year 3, we have Bishop Barber. I want to acknowledge the Wittens. They are here. They are our very, very gracious donors. Robert and Barbara, would you stand up? They have a long professional career of distinguished service in Northern Virginia, out of Springfield, Virginia. As a native Virginian, I'm so proud of them, and we have hit it off with them. They love the Religion Department, and we love them, and we're so grateful that they're able to be here. To show you the support we feel at Baylor University from the Department of Religion, here to give you remarks is President Linda Livingstone. I'm very grateful for her support. She's always been supportive of the Department of Religion and everything we do. President Livingstone, we'd ask you to come and bring some remarks.
Well, thank you, Dr. Weaver, and again, it's wonderful to have all of you join us for this really special day and this wonderful lecture series that we began 3 years ago. We are so excited to host a lecture series that celebrates speakers who care very deeply about how Christian faith is expressed in the public square, and that is a value that we hold very deeply here at Baylor University. As you heard, this has been around since 2018, and we are so grateful to the Wittens for being here, for supporting this, and really having the vision for a lecture series like this that has become such an important part of our life here at Baylor University. So thank you all so much for your generosity and for coming all the way to Texas to be a part of this today. I was telling them earlier, I'm going to be in Virginia watching our women play basketball in Blacksburg, so we're just flying back and forth across the country this week to celebrate together. We did have the privilege of having Reverend Dr. Kenyatta Gilbert here 2 years ago for the first lecture series, and Dr. Weaver mentioned the statues. If you have not seen those statues, you need to go over and see them in front of the Tidwell Bible Building, which was recently renovated, and it's just a really special place to celebrate our first 2 Black graduates on this campus. It was such a privilege to have Kenyatta with us a couple of years ago. And then last year, Dr. Bill Leonard, founding dean and professor of divinity emeritus at Wake Forest, was with us, and he talked about how we can confront and mend the fractures among evangelicals in our world, which we know is such a huge issue in our country today. And today we have such a privilege to hear from Reverend Dr. William Barber, who is president and senior lecturer of Repairers of the Breach. Don't you love that name, Repairers of the Breach? That's awesome. Love that. And co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. Proverbs 29:7 says, "The righteous care about justice for the poor." And Reverend Dr. Barber is someone who cares deeply about poor and oppressed communities and has spent decades advancing those causes through the work that he's doing. You know, here at Baylor, we had the privilege last month to break ground on our memorial to enslaved persons on Founders Mall. It's an important step for this campus in recognizing that chattel slavery is woven into the history of our university and the founders of this university. The memorial will be a wonderful area of reflection and gathering on our campus and a symbol of our ongoing commitment to racial equity and compassion as followers of Christ. And as we complete the monument, we are excited to hear from someone today who has given his life to advocating for racial justice in our nation. So, Dr. Barber, we are so grateful to have you with us and for your commitment to serve. So I just welcome you all, and I'm going to turn this back over to Dr. Weaver, who's going to do a more formal introduction of our speaker today. So thank you all.
I'm going to repeat the many things that we could say about Bishop William Barber. He has recently gone to Yale after spending many years, 29, at a church in North Carolina. I think that what it tells me is that he is able to bring together, to integrate in his own experience, in his own life, the work of Scripture, the work of the church, and the work of the academy. It's the kind of things that we hope to be able to do at Baylor University. He's written 4 books. Maybe he'll tell us a little bit about that. He is a graduate of North Carolina Central University, an MDiv from the same place, a handful of you, Duke University, and a doctor of ministry from Drew University. He has already 10 honorary doctorates to honor the work that he has done. I've already spent an hour with him today, and he talked to us about poverty in the United States, and the figures are they're simply overwhelming about the work he's trying to do with initiating the Poor People's Campaign. I would like to mention one other thing that you perhaps saw in the news, and this is where I'm sure Dr. Barber didn't want to be in the news, but discrimination of people with physical disabilities still exists. And he was not able to stay in a particular seat at a movie theater in North Carolina with his mother. I want you to Google that story, and I want you to be reminded that there is work still to be done, and that Dr. Barber is a prophetic word for all of us in the work he's already doing. To me, this is simply an unbelievable day, Dr. Witten and Barbara, that we have Bishop Barber with us. And what we're going to do before he comes, he has asked that we watch a short video, but before that, a member of his team, Danielle Holmes, is going to come and make an announcement. So we'll have the announcement, then we'll have the video, and then we'll have Bishop Barber speak.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure and honor to be here today. Thank you all so much for having us here. My name is Danielle Holmes. I'm from Jackson, Mississippi. I am the National social justice organizer with Repairs of the Breach, doing work with the Poor People's Campaign. And we have today here also the Texas Poor People's Campaign, Danita Jones, the tri-chair, along with the coordinating committee. If you all would just stand quickly and on the job. Workers to the State House Assembly. So just want to give y'all a hand clap and thank you all for the work you're doing, and hopefully you all can connect. Now I have one ask of you all for me. If you will take out your phones, and raise them when you have them out and ready. All right. I would ask that you text MORAL, MORAL, to 38542. Again, text MORAL, MORAL, to 38542. This number will connect you and sign you up with the Poor People's Campaign, where you all can get the updates on all of our actions and what's happening with our movement, and join us. And you'll, if you join us, you'll get emails, newsletters, powerful information, powerful movement resources, even on the Poor People's Campaign website. So we ask that you utilize those. The fact sheet is there, Third Reconstruction, our moral agenda, our Jubilee platform, all of this great information is there for you all to use. So please feel free to use it and sign up, and thank you all so much. So now we'll bring up Reverend Bishop Barber.
We must be honest about the foundations of the political and economic systems we call America. I love America because of her potential, but I know that America will never even get close to being a more perfect nation until we are honest about the politics of rejection.
I'm here today to share my daughter Venus' story. Venus discovered a small lump in her breast. She wasn't insured. Venus had to be approved for every prescription and every piece of medical equipment that she needed. I'm standing here today in solidarity with the Poor People's Campaign, because no one should have to bury their child in America because they don't have health care insurance.
I'm 46 years old. I've lived in poverty here in West Virginia every day of my life. And I'm working. I am working poor with a bachelor's degree. I'm doing the best I can with what I have.
I'm a second-generation fast food worker, and I've experienced the cycle of poverty firsthand. Growing up, I watched my mother endure long hours of back-breaking labor, doing everything she could to feed me and my sisters. My employer barely pays me enough to pay rent and utilities, let alone the medical expenses with my mother.
I worked 41 years in the coal mines. I have black lung, and it's just unfathomable what these poor coal miners have to go through in order to get what they have worked for and deserve.
I'm a Vietnam veteran. My only chance of going to college was joining the Army.
It was one thing to know that you didn't have water and you couldn't afford your water. It's a whole nother to find out that they shut off your entire community and none of you matter.
But when I lost my housing, health care, and income all at the same time, I was terrified, panicked.
Now I'm also a Kansas farmer's wife. Kansas farmers are committing suicide at a far greater rate than the national average.
Hi, my name is Pamela Rich. I'm from Niles County, Alabama, and I live in a mobile home. for my 2 kids. And I got raw sewage. I don't have no money on the house.
This is the largest encampment in Aberdeen. There's about 1,000 people in a town of 16,000 who are homeless.
In my community, we were all shut off for a day because none of us could afford our water bills. In the past, my family wasn't able to afford electricity in the winter. It was very hard on all of us.
But the indigenous people in the surrounding communities are already being affected. We talk about health care. We talk about worrying about the environment, but yet when they're allowing open pit mines and letting it leak into the land, into the water, the high rate of cancer and the high bills of health is going to continue to raise because of corporations and greed and politicians that don't want to listen.
There's a new chemical company that's producing another carcinogen in our community. It's amazing the people who just started dying of cancer.
This wall, this is sin of the highest order.
I put my life on the line 17 years old to defend constitutional USA against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And right now what we have domestic enemies right here.
And it's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore.
Our brothers and sisters are sleeping on the street. For a country this rich to have so many people poor, it's immoral and it's wrong.
Our backs are against the wall, and we got no choice but to push.
And together we will proclaim liberty throughout the land, for the enslaved, for the poor, and for us all.
Follow that breaking news in Albany, where a large group of protesters have moved into the street.
Washington Avenue between City Hall and Lark Street closed down.
Protesters with the Poor People's Campaign of Indiana.
2 o'clock on the East Coast, 2 o'clock in the middle, 2 o'clock on the West Coast. A wave that historians tell us has never happened before.
Our communities, Muslim communities, who have joined the Poor People's Campaign, you can count on us.
Our democracy is in trouble. Our democracy is in trouble. And we come to demand.
I cannot stand here and claim to be a follower of Jesus Christ and be silent about the moral outrage that is going on in our country.
Because it's crucial that we make ourselves heard. No one is listening.
We are the Poor People's Campaign, a national call from all of us. And we are here. We are poor. We are burdened. And we're here to say to our nation's capital and to the highest court of this land that everybody has a right to live. Everybody has a right to learn. Everybody has a right to love. Everybody has a right to live choices. Everybody has a right to vote. Everybody has a right to thrive in this society. Everybody say, oh! I believe that we will win. I believe that we will win. He does fight and he taught us how to fight.
The poor and their clergy. We read Article 6 of the Kentucky State Constitution that says we have a right to free assembly.
We are demanding that we stop the war on our poor.
It's times like these when throughout history prophets have to arise to sound the alarm.
Together until humanity is respected and children are protected and civil rights and labor rights and human rights are never neglected. Now is our time for third reconstruction. We are not an insurrection, but we are a resurrection.
For we ask it in your name and believe it done. Amen. You know, every time I look at that tape, it's sobering because a number of those people are not even with us, and I'll tell you why in a minute. They should be here, but they're not, and yet they are in spirit. Madam President, thank you so much for coming. I know you have millions of things to do, but to attend this lecture, thank you. Thank you to my new brother, Doug, for inviting me to come, thinking that I might have something to say that could be helpful in furtherance of religious education, and for being persistent. His brother is persistent. I'm telling you, he needs, I understand why he leads the Department of Religion. To my dear brother, Dr. West, and all the good people at Church Without Walls who were so kind and gracious to have us to come. To that whole group of undergraduate students, I've been watching y'all over there, don't you? I see them over there. To all of you who've come, to members of the Poor People's Campaign here in Texas, who just were a part of an effort on March the 2nd, never happened before in history. 32 states and District of Columbia, simultaneous mobilization in 32 state capitals to say we are not an insurrection, we are resurrection, we won't be silent anymore, we're going to take back the mic from the extremists, and we launched a campaign on March 2nd to touch 15 million poor and low-wage infrequent voters between now and November, the most massive attempt of poor and low-wage folk and religious leaders and advocates in history to wake the sleeping giant, poor and low-wage voters. And y'all ought to celebrate them because Texas was a big part of that. And we did some numbers of it today. Since February, your efforts have reached over 100 million people in the campaign we're building this year. And then lastly, if you all did not meet Fannie Lou Hamer, if you meet Danielle Holmes, you're meeting the next closest thing to Fannie Lou Hamer. And so we thank God for her and for her power and for her commitment. Now, today, as I said to the good folk at Church Without Walls, I'm not a prop plane, which means I don't take off fast. You know, I can't zzz like that. I'm like a Boeing 757, maybe 767. So it takes me a minute to just taxi, if you will. And I don't do bumper sticker stuff. I just don't do that. And I try not to be loud and wrong. So I got to do it with footnotes a lot, because worst thing you can do is be loud and wrong. Bible in a moment, but I want to lecture wisdom from Ezekiel for working on a third reconstruction in this moment. What is the wisdom from Ezekiel for working on a third reconstruction? A reconstruction to our sponsors that would address poverty and systemic racism and ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. What does Ezekiel, and by way of Ezekiel, the Word of God say to us about public policy and public theology, and if there even is a need for a third reconstruction? Now, I'm going to come back to the text. I want to lift up 8 pieces of Ezekiel that I think speak to us today, right? Now, I'm from the South. I'm a evangelical, Congregationalist, Pentecostal, Episcopal, Presbyterian. I'm all of that. I'm mixed up real good. But at the end of the day, I love Jesus. And I love Jesus enough to love other folk who love Muhammad, who love Abraham. That's the Jesus I love. But when I was in seminary, we learned that you cannot exegete a biblical text without understanding its Sitz und Leben, the setting of the text. But you also could not be honest about your exegesis if you did not take into account the context
in which you're in when you're exegeting. As Dr. Charles Long used to say, if you got some slaves on the top of the slave ship praying to God, and you got a slave, the bottom of the slave ship, and you've got slave purchasers on the top of the ship praying, are they praying to the same God? And if they are they asking the same thing? That context has a lot to do with how we hear and see Scripture. And then you cannot exegete the biblical text without understanding the zits and Laban of the author. Now, what was the setting from which the author spoke or were touched by God to speak? We must exegete the context the biblical text was written in, but we must also exegete and extract the context in which we are discerning God's word for us. So, we are in America. And I say that with no animosity. As you heard me say, I love America. But I love America enough to recognize that we have potential that is yet unreached and repentance that is yet unspoken. And until we do, we cannot even further realize what it means to even try to be a more perfect union. America is a democracy, Danita, that has needed a lot of work. Yes, some good things have happened, but it has not come without work, without wailing, and without lives and blood. As Dr. King once said, we have a high blood pressure of creeds, but have often had an anemia of deeds. It is a miracle that we've gotten where we are, considering the anemia of deeds. So over and over again in America, we have had to have reconstruction. Driving this need for reconstruction has been the role that racism and classism have played in deconstructing the commitments that were written down in the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. Is an admittance that we are not perfect. More formal, more perfect union. Establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our prosperity. You know, we made welfare a bad word, and welfare is in our Constitution. The deconstruction of our promises has forced us over and over again to have to engage in reconstruction. Things like this. Our Declaration of Independence declared that reconstruction and change is a necessity of citizenship and democracy itself. The Declaration of Independence says you aren't even a good citizen if you don't believe and participate in reconstruction. Listen one more time to the Declaration of Independence. I know normally we go, where we start, but listen at the inside of it. To secure these rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That's problematic right there too, isn't it? Men. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and institute a new government. The Declaration of Independence says in its moral amplification that recognizing when reconstruction needs to happen is a right of citizenship. It's a duty that we operate less than citizens when we allow things to happen that go against the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Even in our hymns that we sing, like America, listen at the second line of America the Beautiful. O beautiful for pilgrims' feet, whose stern impassioned stress a thoroughfare of freedom beat across the wilderness. America, America, God mend thine every flaw. Confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. John J. Chapman once wrote that the reason why America has to constantly go through Reconstruction is because every time we sat at a table to write a declaration or to write a constitution, he said that racism and the consideration of race and, if you will, class was there like a snake, a sleeping serpent, he said, coiled up under the table. And as soon as there was an attempt to address racism and to address, that snake would bite and poison the conversation. Listen to him. He says, let us consider the first 50 years of our national history. There was never a moment in the first 50 years of our national history during this time when slavery as an issue was not a sleeping serpent. That issue laid coiled up under the table during the deliberations of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And that snake bit every time there was an attempt to address the issue of slavery. It poisoned every consideration until finally the situation was so poisoned that the founders chose not to even mention the word slavery in the Constitution. The way to deal with it was to avoid it. And so they used terms like 3/5 of a person. But they never said the word slavery. They never outlawed it in the original. And the inability to deal with that meant that the nation constantly had to deal with over and over and over and over again that Reconstruction became necessary because slavery was always on everybody's mind. It was in every situation. Every time that we purchased or stole some new land, slavery was a consideration. What are we going to do about this issue? And because we did not deal with it, just like we did not deal early on with women's right to vote or the right for poor folk to vote who did not possess land, eventually the refusal to deal with it led to war because the nation became so sick from the serpent's constant poisoning of every situation. Racism and poverty forced the need for Reconstruction. And then there was war. And then after the war, there was Reconstruction. Do y'all know what I mean by, when I say third Reconstruction, what I'm suggesting is that there have been two. There have been two Reconstructions in America, but both of them were broken and incomplete. The first Reconstruction took place in the shadow of slavery, and amid the wreckage of the Civil War, African Americans joined hands with whites from both the North and the South, especially poor whites in the South, who came to see that slavery and racism hurt them too. They formed what they call moral fusion coalitions. They elected new leaders all over the South, even here in Texas, even though they had some particular violence in Texas that they didn't have in other places. The first Reconstruction came together, blacks and whites came together in southern states less than 3 years after the Civil War, and they hammered out new state and national constitutions that created national citizenship open to people of all races. They built the first public school systems. They extended the ballot to all men regardless of color. Together they launched a brave experiment of an expansive democracy. Reconstruction was the struggle to rebuild and reinvent the Southern society after the war and thereby rebuild and reconstruct America itself. But there were deconstructors around too. And by 1870s, there were those who said no to the Reconstruction. And they began to fight it in the courts. They began to fight it at the ballot box. They began to fight it violently. And when they got the reins back in 1877, when there was an election, there was a compromise called the Rutherford B. Hayes Compromise. When a candidate for president lost the popular vote, but was put in office by the Electoral College and then compromised and said, if you give me the presidency, I'll give you the Supreme Court, I'll pull the troops out of the South, I will effectively end Reconstruction. And by 1881, 1882, 1883, 1884, discrimination and public accommodations was put back in the law. The 1875 law against racism in public spaces and in the world was stricken as unconstitutional. That power, listen now, was put back in the hands of the states. And the states then began to use that power to undo Reconstruction. Since we're in Texas, 9 years following the Civil War, Texas was in turmoil as its people attempted to solve political, social, and economic problems produced by the war. Emancipation changed the labor system, and the end of slavery forced a redefinition of the relationship between blacks and whites. The change in labor and the cost of the war threatened to undermine the economic power of those who had dominated antebellum economic life. This actually comes from a historian that is arguing that Reconstruction was a bad thing, and argued that attempts to move toward freedom after slavery for all people was in fact a threat to the economic life of Texas, a bad thing. And persons like that during the first Reconstruction or at the end of the Reconstruction, you know what their mantra was? Listen at it, I pulled it. We got to redeem America, advance the interests of the wealthiest sectors of society, overturn the programs that are leading to justice, and make America great again. Not in the year 2000, but in 1877, 1888, and Reconstruction was ended. Then, a century later, we had a second Reconstruction, 1954 to 1968. Black and white together, along with brown allies. They turned back to fusion politics to revive the promise of America. Was born in the South, began with the Brown decision, Brown versus Board of Education, that said separate but equal was unconstitutional. Together, these white and black and brown allies integrated public schools, declared an agenda to end segregation. They fought for fair wages, economic justice, voting rights, education, Medicare, health care, long overdue civil rights protection. They won the Civil Rights Act in 64, the Voting Rights Act in 65, but it cost, God knows it cost in lives. This new fusion movement even went a long way to winning equal rights for women. People don't remember that the Civil Rights Act did more for white women than in some ways it did for black people. Thank God it did. It lifted up opportunities for women. The second Reconstruction reinvigorated the words of the Declaration of Independence in the U.S. Constitution. Once again, though, right in the middle of it, raving Dixiecrats and so-called conservative extremists revolted against this unity. They revolted against this fusion. They revolted against the rights for black folk and brown folk and women and poor people. There was a backlash, and the backlash was called the Southern Strategy. You know what the Southern Strategy said? This is what the Southern Strategy said. We got to make America great again. And the way that we do it, according to the footnotes in a book called Time for Illusion, is that we must engage in positive polarization, positive division. Division was claimed as a positive thing, and we must pit poor, white folk and Anglo-Saxons and black folk and brown folk against one another. It's the only way to take the country back. We must engage in social engineering backwards. And we must build a backwards movement from Maryland all the way over to Arizona. Kevin Phillips, who was a Nixon Republican strategist at the time, he called it Sunshine. He said, we must deliberately play the race card. We must play it in our rhetoric. We must create division. We must frame the Democratic Party as the black party. We must make sure that people like John Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson never get any votes anymore in the majority out of the South. This is what they said. I'm just reporting. This is what they said. And they said that this strategy would work, and if it didn't work, and the division got out of hand, and the division ended up creating a Frankenstein that they could not control, they would lie. And say, we didn't have nothing to do with this. And they were lying. Until one day, Lee Atwater, a former strategist, did an interview and forgot the tape was on. Since this is a house of faith, it's also a house of truth. So let me speak some truth. This is what he said on tape about this strategy. He said, you got to create division. And the way you do it is in 1954, if you want to create division, you start out by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. But by 1968, you can't say nigger because it'll backfire you. So instead of saying nigger, you say words like force busing and states' rights. And then you get even more abstract and you say, all we're talking about is tax cuts. But all of those become code words of division. You make people think you're talking about economic things, but the byproduct of those things is that blacks get hurt worse than whites, and whites and blacks get pitted against each other, and the poor and the low-wage folk get hurt, and the society gets divided, and the extremists play in the divide and win in the divide. I know I haven't come to Ezekiel yet. I'll get to Ezekiel. We're in America. So that's history. But then the question is, okay, Barbara, that's all good and well. That's first Reconstruction, that's 1960. But what about now? Well, where are we now? Since we didn't finish these Reconstruction, what did we end up with today? We end up with an America in 2019 where there are 140 million poor and low-wage people in this country. 140 million. 43% of Americans, 3% of the US population, 50% of our children. 140 million. 140 million. 51% of children under the age of 18, 38 million. 40% of adults between the ages of 1864, 81 million. 45% of our elders over 65, 20 million. 33% of white people, 67 million. 60% of black people, 25 million. 65% of Latinx, 34 million. 41% of Asians, 7 million. Because we did not finish the reconstructions and we abandoned them and broke them, this is where we are in 2019. Now, during COVID, the number went up to 150 million, and then it dropped down to 112 million because of investments that we made, and then we ended those investments within 6 months. And now it's right back up to 135 million. Where are we? Where are we? That we often don't talk about. 52 million people in 2019 made less than a minimum wage of $15 an hour. 400 people made an average of $97,000 an hour. 3 people had more money than the bottom 50% of Americans combined. 150 million Americans control only 2% of the 2% of the wealth. 12% of U.S. households. 38 million households can't afford their water bill. 4 million families get up every morning and can buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water. During COVID, billionaires made $2 trillion. $4 trillion spent on COVID relief, 68% of it went to corporations. 1.3 trillion came straight from the Treasury Department, didn't even come through Congress, but ended up mostly in the pockets of corporations. Poor and low-wage workers were suddenly, you're not a service worker anymore. You are an essential worker. That's right, essential worker. Let's ring a bell at 6 o'clock. Let's clap our hand. Let's blow out. But I'm an essential worker, but I don't have health care. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. You don't need health care. I'm an essential worker, but I don't have a living wage. Don't worry about that. Living wage has been $7, a minimum wage $7.25 since 2009. There has not been a raise in the minimum wage since 2009. Don't worry about that. Go to work and save the rest of us. But I don't have paid family. Go to work. You're essential. So we sent people to work, afraid they would get infected, sick, hospitalized, and die. Essential, but expendable. 350,000 people died so far during COVID, not from COVID, from the lack of health care. Workers are working harder, corporations are making more, but workers' wages have not gone up. $7.25 an hour, that's what Texas minimum wage is. At $7.25, there's not a county in this country where you can afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. $7.25, $7.25 an hour. You know what they say in Congress? They say this, I've heard this. They say, preacher, listen, if a person makes $7.25 an hour and they work 40 hours a week, they make about $14,000 a year, which means they're in the bottom lower middle class. They're not poor. They're not poor. And waitresses and waiters, their minimum wage is $2.13 an hour in 2024. I met women out here on the road that during COVID were forced to become prostitutes during COVID because they would go in, they'd only make $2.13, $2.15 an hour plus tip, and perverts would come in and say, now you know I can get you some more money. And some of them had to do it. That's what happens when reconstructions are ended over and over and over again, till we come to a point now where as we sit in this room right now, 295,000 people will die from poverty this year. There's a new book out called Poverty by America by Desmond, and there's a new study out that says that poverty is the 4th leading cause of death. David Brady was the writer of that. 800 plus people a day. Touch your neighbor and say, he got to be lying. There's no way in the world. That's the reality in the richest nation in the world. Well, here's another one. 87 million people either uninsured or underinsured. And for every 500,000 people that don't have health care, 2,800 die. We're the only country of the 25 wealthiest countries in this world that does not offer some form of universal health care. Do you hear me? There are 12 million immigrant workers, including 5 million so-called undocumented people who were on the front lines of the pandemic. In other words, the very folk we want to kick out now helped save us during the pandemic. And yet, while they were working on the front lines of the pandemic, in meat packing plants and other things, they couldn't get access to pandemic relief. They couldn't get it. And now, we want to kick them out. Well, that's not the first time. After World War II and after Korea, Eisenhower created the program called Operation Wetback. Said round them all up, put them on a barge, and sail them down the Mississippi River because we through with them now. And so we sent folk back, not home, because this is their home. Texas is their home. New Mexico is their home. Arizona is their home. Because Texas didn't want to be anti-slavery. So Texas decided to break from Mexico because Mexico was anti-slavery by 1840. So when we keep talking about people are illegal aliens, 2 things wrong with that. God don't make aliens. He makes human beings. And from one blood, he made all people. But secondly, we're telling people to go back from the place that once was there. Where are we right now? Since 2010, we have seen an assault on voting rights. There have been over 2,000 plus voter suppression laws passed in a democracy. I was in Germany. Airport, and I was talking to somebody who was from Germany. I was headed to the Vatican. I was going over there. The Pope Francis had invited me to be one of 13 people that responded to his encyclical. They just put a book out about it. But I was flying to Germany, and I was in the place sitting beside a woman. I said, "You from Germany?" She says, "Yes." I said, "Well, isn't Trump from Germany?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Would you like him back?" She said, 9, 9, 9, 9, 9, 9, 9. And she didn't mean the number 9 either. But then she said, "I have a question for you." She said, "I don't understand you." She said, "I read a paper that they're turning back voting rights. How do you all have something and then can vote it away?" This was a German. She said, "How do you do that? How do you possess something and then somebody can take it away. And just in case you think this is just that big numbers, in Texas between 2018 and 2020, there were 11 million poor and low income people. 41% of this state is poor and low income. In Texas, you have to make $23 an hour in a family of 4 to basically eat meat twice a week and have a basic car. There are 5 million people in your workforce in Texas that make less than $15 an hour. That's 5 million adults. That's 26.1% of Asians and Native workers. 48% of black workers make less than 54% of Latino workers, 26% of white workers, 49% of working women, and 63% of women of color. But the majority of the people making less than $15 an hour are white working women with children. And yet when we talk about poverty, and anytime it comes in the public square, what happens? They put a black face or a brown face over to try to intentionally polarize us. And they've been doing it since the ending of Reconstructions in this country. During the most intense period of the pandemic in Texas, all of your Congress people had free health care. Every U.S. congressperson in Texas had free health care. And every U.S. senator had free health care. So they say free health care. All they had to do was get elected. And I've never understood why people get elected and get something free and then don't want the people that got elected to have the same thing they have. But during the most intense period of the pandemic, 5 million people in Texas were uninsured. And because of that, Texas has experienced a 2.1-year decline in life expectancy. That's unnecessary, unavoidable, because health care ought not depend on your job. It ought to depend on your humanity. Because I've never seen so many people thumping Bibles that don't believe in health care, and all you got to do is read the Bible to know Jesus always healed a leper and never charged a copay. Here we are. In Texas, there have been 166 voter restrictive bills between 2020 and 23. 63 anti-LGBTQ bills. Why are folks so worried about other people's beds and not worried about the illicit sexuality going on between the Supreme Court and big business that produces the bastard child of money and politics? Here we are in Texas. 4,000 people in 2021 killed by gun violence. And according to the stats in Texas, you can get a gun easier than you can put food on your table. Here we are in Texas, in America. Now, you say, well, why are you talking about this? Because we don't. We don't talk about these realities. We often say stuff like this shouldn't be brought up in a pulpit on Sunday morning. Sometimes we don't talk about it in our seminaries. We don't want to talk about it. So-called conservatives are obsessed with culture wars and wedge issues designed to create a false sense of grievance among the people. And on the other hand, too many liberals run from the word poverty. They don't even want to say the word poverty. They say, those trying to get into the middle class. No, some folk are poor. Recently, I was at the Vatican in a meeting with economists and philosophers and theologians, and Pope Francis said, today we see that the world has never been so rich, and yet despite such abundance, poverty and inequality persist and grow. In these times of opulence, when it should be possible to put an end to poverty, to abolish poverty, the powers of one-track thinking say nothing of the poor, nothing of the elderly, nothing of the migrants, nothing of the unborn, and the seriously ill. Mostly invisible, they are treated as disposable. And Pope Francis in his encyclical said neoliberalism simply reproduces itself by resorting to the magic theories of spillover or trickle-down economics, and they are all forms of political evil. Did you know that 58 senators, 50 Republicans and 8 Democrats, both senators from Texas, voted no on raising the minimum wage. And it hadn't been raised in 15 years. And in 2020, that was in that town. And they voted. One scholar says this. He said, the truth is we've had a silent depression that has caught up with us. More than a decade ago, a political economist from the University of Maryland said, what we are really beginning to experience is a process of slow decay, punctuated by a reoccurring economic crisis, one in which reforms achieve sporadic gains, but the long-term trends of growing inequality, economic dislocation, failing democratic accountability, deepening poverty, ecological degradation, greater invasions of liberty, and growing imprisonment, especially of minorities, continue to slowly and quietly challenge the belief in the capacities and the moral integrity of the overall system and its governing elites. In other words, the question is not just saving the democracy, but what kind of democracy we want to save. I was at the UN speaking to the Special Rapporteur on Poverty, and he said, Reverend Barber, I'm not even a person of faith. I don't. He said, but I need to say something to you since you are. He said, we have three great problems in this country when it comes to poverty. He said, number one, the lie that we don't know what to do. He said, that's a lie. We know how to fix it. We could fix it tomorrow. We could end poverty tomorrow with about 7 pieces of legislation. And it would all benefit the whole society. It wouldn't break the society. It would actually make, in fact, if you raise the minimum wage to $15, it would pump $330 billion into the economy. He then said, there's a second lie. We don't have the money to do it. He said, we got the money. He said, but here's the big problem. He said, the big problem is we lack the moral capacity to get it done. And he said, if I believed in God, I would suggest that's a church problem. That's a problem that those of you who believe in faith ought to be. That's a God-sized problem. Shifting the moral consciousness. I was at MIT, and you know MIT, they don't do a lot of talking about theology, not at MIT. And I heard a professor sound like a prophet, Doug. He was teaching us, and he said, his name is Otto Schwammer, and he said, there's a blind spot in America's economic theory today, and it's called consciousness. Our refusal to have an economic theory that looks and sees that we are all integrated. And we really do need each other. We really do need each other. So, we're in America. These are the facts, many of the facts that exist right now. We need moral analysis, moral articulation, moral agenda, moral activism. Is there a word from the Lord? And I believe that one of the places, there are many places, but one of the places we could look is Ezekiel. Reconstruction is not a new concept, it's a prophetic concept. It's as old as the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel wrote in a tough time. Ezekiel's Sitzenleben was tough. It's frank, it's a penetrating book. Ezekiel was a priest whom God had called to be a prophet. He was a pastor who was called to be a prophet to the nation. And he had to prophesy to a nation that was split in two. It was divided. And both sides were suffering from worshiping individuals, worshiping idols, self-centeredness, social injustice against the vulnerable. And most of the religious activity at that time had gone to protecting unrighteousness rather than standing for righteousness. It's so bad that in the 22nd chapter of Ezekiel, he calls the nation the bloody city. He says, you got so much blood on your hands. Will you judge the bloody city, is what he says. And God told Ezekiel to pronounce judgment. This is the Sitzenleben. And there are 8 things in Ezekiel that I think, for those of us who think theologically and morally, need to hear. Number 1, Ezekiel in the first chapter shows us that you have to take seriously the history of what he calls stiff-necked people and recognize that when you first start talking about justice, they probably won't hear you. He said that in chapter 1. He says, listen, he says, God said to me, son of man, stand up on your feet and I will speak to you. Son of man, I'm sending you to a rebellious nation, a nation that is against me. The people whom I'm sending to you, they are obstinate, they are stubborn, and they probably will not listen to you. But do not be afraid of them. If you're going to have reconstruction in a nation, you have to have some moral voices that are not afraid to speak the truth. Prophetic voices are not guaranteed they will be heard, but they must guarantee they will speak. They must guarantee they will speak. William Lloyd Garrison was one of those back in the 1800s. He was an abolitionist, and he said, I intend to speak the truth. I will not write with moderation. Go tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm, but do not tell me to be moderate when it comes to challenging the evil of slavery. You got to have that in society. You got to have folk like Fannie Lou Hamer that will speak to a convention even when the president calls an impromptu press conference like Lyndon Baines Johnson did to shut her down. You cannot forget that Martin Luther King was put out of his own denomination. C.Eric Lincoln, my professor, he's gone on now, he taught anyone who dares to engage in prophetic preaching and challenge the death and the death-dealing structures of our society must be prepared to meet resentment and resistance. Speaking the truth in a time of lies is the most revolutionary thing you can do. Because if you can't speak the truth and hold on to it despite being pushed, told, not listened to, you never get anything else done. Secondly, Ezekiel teaches us that in order to change, the church and prophetic leaders must be willing to lay among the people that are hurting. Listen at this, verse 12 in chapter 3. Then the Spirit lifted me up, and I heard behind me a loud rumbling sound as the glory of the Lord rose from the place, and it was the sound of wings of a living creature. Verse 15, I came to the exiles who lived at Tel Aviv near the Kebar River, and there where they were living, I sat among them for 7 days, and I was distressed. You cannot call for reconstruction unless you experience the pain. You got to go where the people are. You got to live among them. You have to see them, and you have to make the rest of the world see. As I've been traveling the country from Appalachia to the Delta, from New York to rural North Carolina, from South Carolina to the San Francisco Tenderloin, from El Paso to Illinois, from the Apache land in Arizona to the homeless camps in Washington State, from Flint, Michigan to Jackson, Mississippi, from Kansas farmers committing suicide to Eastern Kentucky. One thing I have heard all over and over, I don't care whether the people are black or white or brown or whatever, they say this everywhere we go. Nobody comes to see us. Nobody talks to us. No presidential candidate. Nobody comes to see us. And I thought that was a problem. But then something else hit me. The Pew Foundation decided to do a study of 50,000 sermons in American pulpits. And when they studied those sermons, even though poverty and how we treat the least of this is preeminently on the lips of Jesus and the lips of the prophet, they found out that sermons about poverty and injustice didn't even register 1% in the American pulpit. Kevin Cruz tells us one of the reasons why. In his book, One Nation Under God, you ought to get it, he talks about how there has been an intentional design in America to purchase the American pulpit. Traces all the way back to the 1930s. When oil barons and other people wanted to purchase the American pulpit so that the pulpit would be controlled by what they wanted said rather than what God said. And we have to know this. Somebody has to help us see what's going on. The fourth thing is Ezekiel. In Ezekiel, there's a scripture where Ezekiel's wife gets sick and dies, and God says, you have until tomorrow to bury her, and then you got to go back to work. Now that seems kind of harsh. But Ezekiel, God teaches us through Ezekiel that there are moments in history when we are in a crisis of civilization and you can't relent in love. You can't relent in justice. You can't sit down. You can't rest. Freedom cannot rest. Justice cannot rest. Because what you must recognize is those who are committed to meanness are committed. Those who are committed to injustice are committed. We must realize the fierce urgency of now. And many of the things we are fighting for, we fought for too long. Living wage has been we've been talking about that since the 1900s when Theodore Roosevelt did his bull speech talking about living wages. And Martin Luther King talked about it at the March on Washington. Universal health care since the early 1900s. Labor rights since the 30s. These things are things that should have been done a long time ago, but now they threaten even more the possibility of this democracy. Number 5, Ezekiel teaches us the root of the problem. Listen to this, Ezekiel 22. There is a conspiracy in the land between the princes and the priest. The princes and the priests, this is Ezekiel 22 as I paraphrase, the princes and the priests have become like wolves, making prey out of the people. They are hurting people's lives to make unjust gains. The politicians are doing this, and the priests and the prophets are lying and giving false visions and saying that God said it's all right when God didn't say a thing. That's actually in the Bible. And the word for violence there is a Hebrew word, karmas, which means to treat violently and wrong. But the word that got me for living, for people and lives in that text is nephesh. Where are the theologians and the biblicist in here? Some of them in here. Correct me if I'm wrong now. In Hebrew, it's nephesh. It doesn't mean you just killing somebody's physical life. Nephesh means soul. It means life. It means self. It means person. It means desire. It means passion. It means appetite. It means emotion. In other words, when mean politicians join together with priests and preachers who won't correct them but instead join them in a kind of religious nationalism that attempts to sanctify injustice, that kind of unholy alliance destroys people's lives. And Ezekiel says whenever it happens, it makes it so that the poor and the needy are mistreated, the foreigner is hurt, people are denied justice, and extortion and robbery and oppression rule the land. But then there's another lesson. Ezekiel says, but in the midst of all of this, God says that change is not impossible. And so in the 30th verse of the 22nd chapter, God says to Ezekiel, I'm looking for somebody who will stand in the gap. God says, I don't need but one somebody. I don't need the whole name. I don't need everybody. I need something. Ezekiel, you check it out in your Bible. Check it out on your phone. Ezekiel chapter 22, verse 30, he says, I'm looking for somebody. In other words, everything that you see that's unjust doesn't have to be if somebody will stand up. If somebody will speak out. If somebody will make it their business to say things don't have to be this way. And then Ezekiel doesn't find anybody. In fact, the text ends kind of sad because he says, I couldn't find anybody. But then 15 chapters over in chapter 37, God says, I know where I can find somebody. I know where I can find it. And he points out a 7th principle for reconstruction. Reconstruction happens when the rejected lead the revival. He says to Ezekiel, there's some folk in a valley. Now, people didn't even give them the decency of a burial. They just threw them in the valley. They didn't even bury them. You can go to the valley, look over there, you see their bones. But guess what? That's where hope is. And he says, Ezekiel, I need you to go organize them. I need you to go preach to them. I need you to go. And he said, Ezekiel, do you believe this Poor People's Campaign can live? Do you believe that these folk that don't have living wages can live? Do you believe these people that are dying from poverty in America can live? And Ezekiel says, I don't know. And God says, right answer, now go preach. Go organize. Just go down in the valley, go where the hurting people are, because that's the hope. That's the hope. The very people that have been hurt, that's the hope. The very people that are on the ground can get up. That's the hope. If you go down there and organize and then step back, I'll pour out my spirit on them. I will make them stronger than they even imagine, and they will become a mighty army. Today, it might be that the hope of this democracy is in the hands of the poor. It might be that's in the hands of the poor and low wage. It might be that, as Mortman said, faith, wherever it develops into hope, doesn't cause rest but unrest. It might be in all these tragic numbers, 140 million, 135 million, all those numbers, but that's an army. Nobody's talked to them, but what if they start talking to themselves? What if we start talking to them? What if the church starts talking to them? What if seminaries start talking to them? What if we do what God said and go to the valley of dry bones? That's where the hope is, and it's where the hope has always been. America never changed because of some edict from D.C. It changed when the folk in the valley decided, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. That's when it changed. When the folk in the valley started standing up. And you know what? Can I tell y'all a secret? Lean in. God has a way, and it's all through Scripture, of making it so that the stones that the builders rejected can end up being the cornerstones of a new reality. God has this way that after crucifixion, you can get a Pentecost. And folk that you thought were dejected and hurt, something happens and they come together and the Spirit gets on them and they start changing. God has fixed it. So that the very people that have been put down can turn the world upside down. You know, I told y'all all those numbers, right? I said all those numbers. Let me give you some other numbers. Yes, there are 135 million poor people, but did you know that in this country right now, there is not a state in this country where the margin of victory in an electoral campaign was within 3%, or like Texas, 5%, where poor and low-wage people don't represent 34 to 46% of the voting population. Uh-oh. Wait a minute. You remember in the Bible when Pharaoh kept making the folk make bricks without straw, and then Pharaoh said, wait a minute, they have become more of them than us. Poor and low-wage people now make up over 30, 40% of the electorate. There's not a state in this country where if poor and low-wage people who did not vote, and the number one reason they don't vote is that nobody talks to them, but if somebody talked to them, if just 20% of them voted. And now we are in a country where 72% of the people want health care and 70% want living wages. In a country right now in Texas, 33% of the electorate in Texas is poor and low wage. That's 7 million people. In the last election, 3.3 million didn't vote. The presidential election in Texas was decided by only 630,000 votes, which means that if you just mobilize 19% of poor and low wage voters in Texas that didn't vote, not for a candidate, but for issues that a candidate might represent, they could change the outcome. Texas is not a red or a blue state. It is a state yet to be organized where poor people show their power. In your Senate race, and I ain't talking about, I'm not going to be positive, I'm just talking about what I'm talking about. In your Senate race, the last time the margin of victory wasn't but 200,000 votes. 3 million poor and low-wage folk didn't vote. If just 10% of that 3 million was to be moved, they could determine the outcome of your Senate race. And what if they said, we're not going to vote for personality, we're going to vote for living wages. We're going to check. We're not even going to go down the line and see if a person is Democrat. We're going to go down, do you support living wages? Do you support abolition of poverty? Do you support lifting up women? Do you support ending hate and violence? Are you against Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and homophobia? We're just going to go down the list. We're going to go down the moral list. Maybe we just take the list that Jesus had. The hungry, the least of these, the sick. Where are you on those things? The poor, the brokenhearted, the captive, those on the mountain. That's what we want to know. And we're going to cast our votes, not based on your face, but based on where you stand on the issues. And if just 10% did that in little old Texas, my God. And the last thing Ezekiel teaches us is not only is the hope in the valley of the dry bones, the very people that have been marginalized and put down, he teaches us finally over in the last chapter of Ezekiel. Ezekiel says, from now on, Ralph, the city won't be named the bloody city. that when the marginalized, when the Valley of Dry Bones organizes and stands up, Ezekiel 22, the city is the bloody city. Help me, theologians, help me, biblicists. If I'm wrong, y'all point it out. But by the last chapter of Ezekiel, it's no longer the bloody city. The city becomes Yahweh Shammah. Yahweh Shammah. That's the new name of the city. When the poor, when the marginalized, when those on the bottom, when they organize, when they mobilize, when they stand up, when they become an army of transformation and love, no longer is the country or the city called the bloody city. It's called Yahweh Shammah. And Yahweh Shammah means God is there. Wherever justice is, somebody say, what? Yahweh Shammah. God is there. And I believe the point God is pulling us to is where God, that there is this Pentecostal pool. There is this pool. And you can't rest. You can't be quiet. You got to preach love. You got to preach truth. You got to preach truth. Because that's where God already is. See, you know the God we serve is always coming from where he's already been. You know, he's always going where he's already been. You know, so Yahweh Shammah, and there's that God is already there. God is already there. God is already there. God is already there. When folk decide that they're going to stand up, God is already there. Can't you feel it? Can't you feel the presence? I do. When I get in line with those who have been rejected and they decide they're going to stand up for what's right, I know Yahweh Shammah, God is already there. When I went to West Virginia and met 9 women who were poor and low-wage workers, on Tuesdays they sell tacos so they can commit a community fund to help each other with their menstrual cycles, and they told me to say it just like that. But those 9 women said, Pastor Barber, not only are we going to raise this fund, but we're organizing women now in West Virginia, and we're going to hook up with black women from Alabama, and we women are going to get together and change it. I said, Yahweh Shammah, God is there. When we get in line with folks who don't have access to health care, but they say, we're not going to just die anymore. In fact, some of us going to write in our will that if we die from health care, we're going to tell the preacher to do like Emmett Till's mama did and call the cameras to come right in the church and say, God didn't call them home. Now, God will welcome them home, but I didn't die because God called me home. I died from policy violence. I died, and I want the world to see it so that my death, like Emmett Till's death when his mama showed it, might change the world. When I hear folk making that kind of commitment, Yahweh Shammah. When I get in line with my siblings who are Apaches up in Arizona, and they decide that they're going to stand against multinational companies that are trying to take, I say, Yahweh Shammah. When I see folk that say, we're going to challenge Hamas because Hamas was wrong, and we're going to challenge Netanyahu because Netanyahu is wrong. We're going to challenge both of them, and we're going to challenge the folk killing folk in Somalia, and we're going to challenge the folk killing folk in the Congo, and we're going to challenge folk killing in Yemen, and we also going to challenge the ones that are killing folk right here in America because it makes no sense that 295,000 people are dying every year from poverty. When I see folks standing up and say, we're going to challenge death wherever it is, I say, Yahweh Shammah. When I'm down in Jackson, Mississippi, crying with mothers who got to wash their babies in poison water, and they say, but we're not going to quit. We're going to fight. We're going to fight, just like the folk in Flint fought. And then they're going to hook up with a white community up in Minnesota that's dealing with the same thing. I say, Yahweh Shammah. When I go in the water in the Rio Grande River in El Paso, and I walk with a mother on this side in Texas who goes to visit her husband and her children that were put out because of a glitch in a piece of paper, and we go out in the muddy waters of the Rio Grande, and then there we're in deep muddy water, and all of a sudden the land gets hard, and we end up stepping up on dry ground in the middle of the Rio Grande and have communion. I say, Yahweh Shammah. When I recognize that poor and low-wage people have the power now to challenge what's going on, that poor and low-wage people, the very people that have been discounted and rejected, that nobody wants to talk about, that if they organize, they can actually save, not just save the democracy, but make this democracy a democracy worth saving. I say, Yahweh Shammah. Whenever something wakes you up in the morning and you know love is greater than hate, you know justice is better than injustice, you know that mercy is better than meanness, when you know God is with you, no matter if they listen or not, just standing for what's right, I say Yahweh Shammah. Can't you feel the presence? Can't you feel the presence? Now, down in my little country church in North Carolina, we used to sing it like that. God is already here. You don't hear what I'm saying. He's here when I stand up for what's right. God is here when I stand up for love. God is here when I fight for mercy. God is here when I join with white folk and black folk and brown folk and Asian folk and native folk. You better touch your neighbor and say, God is here whenever I hear the word preached. God is here whenever truth is declared. Look at this room. 40 years ago, we couldn't be in here like that. But God is here. And I want to know, are there any rejected folk in the room? Are there anybody been rejected because of your love? Come on up here. Rejected because of who you love? Come up here. I need you to come up here. Anybody been rejected because you come from a poor community? Come up here. Anybody been rejected because you're gay or you're straight? Come up here. Don't be scared. Anybody been rejected because of your womanhood? Anybody been rejected because you come from a low wage? Now, I know somebody in here that knows what rejection looks like. Come on, you know what it's like. Come on here. Come on here. You know what it looks like in your family. You know what it looks like in your family. You know what it's like to be hurt. And it ain't just the black folk. Come on, my Anglo-Saxon brother. Who over here knows about rejection? Come on up on the stage. Come on up on the stage. You know what it's like to be put down. Come on the stage. Come on, come on. You know what it's like to be hurt. You know what it's like. Where's the professor? That people didn't expect you to be a professor or nothing, but here you are at Baylor. Who are you in this room? Who are you? Who are you? Who are you? It's altar call time. That's right. Come on up here. I'm not going to hurt you. You know what it's like to be put down. You know what it's like to be told you can't finish college. Where are you? Where are you? On this side. Is it you? Is it you? Come on, come on, come on, come on. There she is. Come on, come on. You know what it's like to be broken. Now, y'all ain't going to let there be all black folks standing up here. I know that. I know that because there's some, you know, anyway, any of y'all come from poor white communities that have been written off. Is anybody? Anybody? I see you raising your hand. I see you nodding. Come on up here. Come on. Anybody? 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 Anybody know what it's like to come from Appalachia, another poor part? Anybody that's a Latino and you seen folk, they look at you right funny? Oh, come on, thank you, brother. Come on up here. Anybody knows? Anybody knows? Anybody knows? Anybody look at you funny in your community because you white, but you care about everybody, and they think you crazy. Something wrong with you because you won't go along with religious nationalism. Where are you? Where are you? You came up in a church preaching against gay folk, and you were gay yourself. You come in a church that preaching against all that, and you said, this ain't the Jesus that about. Where are you? Where are you? Where are you? All I stop by to tell you is when, come here. Come here. Get my help. Get there. God is here. Lord have mercy. That's all I'm trying to say. Whenever you see this is Yahweh Shammah. This is the new city. This is God in our midst. This is realized eschatology that points us to what is possible. And if this comes together, reconstruction will be real.
Shall we stand? Thank you for being here. Thank you, Dr. William Barber, for blessing us today. I think that's the right word we'll use today. He's a preacher, and preachers have a tendency to turn lectures into sermons. Look this way. I want to bless you as we prepare to leave this place and go into the world and serve God. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to smile upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift the light of his countenance upon you and grant you his peace. And may the Lord bless you when you go out and come in, when you rise up early and settle late, in your labor and in your leisure, in your laughter and in your tears, until that day when we shall stand at the feet of Jesus, where there is no sunrise or sunset. Amen. Be encouraged.